This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast, where I'm speaking to Michael Marriott about historic roses. Michael is an expert rosarian, chairman of the Historic Roses Group, and author of the recently published book, RHS Roses. We talk about what historic roses are, some of the myths surrounding them, and why they're an excellent choice for your garden, particularly if you're looking for something a little different. I began by asking Michael about his background and how he became interested in historic roses.
I've always been passionate about all plants and gardenings, but actually I didn't get into roses until about 40 years ago. I remember my grandparents had some very miserable ones in their garden, the classic sort of old hybrid teas, with no leaves and maybe an odd flower on top and, planted too far apart. So roses didn't register at all for me. But it's when I came back from having worked abroad in the South Pacific for 5 years, I got by chance into working into a bedding plant and rose nursery just in St Albans. And the roses there were all sort of hybrid teas and floribundas, modern ones. Yeah, it sort of piqued my interest a little bit, but not really. And then because of that, after about just under a year, I got the job up at David Austin's to work there as nursery manager. So that's when my passion first started, because I soon realised that they're such an amazing group of plants and so varied and so useful in the garden as well. And I joined David Austin's at just the right time, just not long after the rose Graham Thomas had been introduced. So David Austin's at that time was still a small nursery. But yes, it grew rapidly because of the introduction of Graham Thomas and the other English roses. So I joined at exactly the right time and very, very, very fortunate. But actually, I just remembered I saw a television program before I joined about David Austin, and he was talking to Susan Williams-Ellis, who's the founder of Port Marion Potteries, and they were looking around at his roses. And I remember him showing a few varieties, including Wise Portia. And I saw that. I thought, oh, gosh, that's just the most beautiful rose I've seen. So maybe that's when I first realised that they were a fantastic group of plants.
I've got the rose Susan Williams-Ellis. It's beautiful as well.
Yeah.
Good to know where that came from. Obviously, now you're involved with the Historic Rose Group. What is your role with that group at the moment? And actually, what is the group? What does it do?
I'm chairman. It's a group of people who are interested, passionate, love historic roses. And so it's an international group, got members all around the world. And most of them are in the UK. But if you become a member, then you'll get a wonderful magazine twice a year of interesting articles about historic roses. And then we organise day tours to gardens with fantastic collections. So we just did one recently to Shropshire, saw a couple of gardens there, very beautiful gardens with fantastic collection. Another one in Suffolk as well. And there was another one not far away from there as well with tremendous collections. So it's a good chance for people to get together and meet, which is always a lovely thing to do, and then just see these wonderful, wonderful roses, which are often very rarely seen. So the one in Suffolk, they had nearly 500 different varieties there. So that was an amazing chance to see roses. I mean, some of them I'd never seen before anywhere, or only maybe once or twice in the long distant past. So it's really good.
And it might sound like a bit of a silly question. Is an historic rose just an old rose?
Well, there's no hard and fast definition. So obviously the true old roses, the Gallicas, Damask, Albas, Centifolias, things like that, the old once flowering roses. And the species roses, of course, they go back to 30 million years ago or something like that. So they're pretty ancient. And the old roses, most of those are 19th century and before, so some of them go back to 12th, 13th century, and some of them might be, even go back to ancient Greek and Roman times, so we just don't know at all. But certainly we include some 20th century roses, so, as a very rough cut-off date, it's sort of middle of the 20th century, really. So some of the early hybrid teas that were introduced at the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, they have very different beasts to the hybrid teas that we grow in gardens today. And then things like the hybrid musks and some of the early shrub roses. And of course, the climbers and ramblers, especially the ramblers. A lot of the ramblers come from the 19th century and some of them before that as well. and then some of the early climbers. So yeah, there's no hard and fast rule. So it's just something that maybe has some sort of something air about it, which you could associate with the old roses. But yeah, as a rough date, 1950, but no hard and fast rules.
And thinking about them, not so much in the abstract, are there more common varieties that people might be familiar with in the category of historic roses?
I suppose the most common ones would be something like Tuscany Superb, the really dark purple one, which you see quite a lot. And Isfahan as well, which is a fantastic rose, arguably one of the very best of the old roses. And then, of course, of the Ramblers, things like Rambling Rector and Albertine, they're fairly well known as well. I mean, I get very cross with people who reject roses because they're only once flowering. It's the old argument that a lot of the other plants like lilacs and peonies and irises and things like that, you're lucky to get a week out of them, or maybe 10 days. Whereas a lot of the old roses, the old calicas and damascus albas and things like that, some of those will flower for 4, 5, or even 6 weeks. So why reject a fantastically beautiful, garden-worthy group of plants that flower longer than most other plants in the garden, just because they don't repeat flower? So yeah, for me, it's a no-brainer. Having said that, some of the more modern historic roses, like hybrid musts, of course, the early hybrid teas and things like that, they do repeat flower, and some of the climbers as well.
And when we think about the ones that do only flower once, is there a kind of general time period that they would do that, or does it spread across the year?
With very, very few exceptions, it'll all be sort of June. I mean, it depends what part of the country you're in, of course. This year was quite early, so some of them started at the end of May. And then some of the species and some of the Scots roses. So there's a wonderful group of roses called Scots roses, which are hybrids of Rosa spinacissima, which is native to the UK, but huge swathes from Iceland all across Europe to sort of Russia and places like that. So they're a very interesting group. They flower very, very early. So they flower in May. So yeah, most of them are in sort of June time, and maybe into July. And then there's one or two that just flower a little bit later into July. But up in Scotland, it will be delayed a little bit more than that.
Going back to what you mentioned, Tuscany Superba, I think sometimes people might tend to go for something like maybe Munstead Wood instead. Would that be a fair assessment to say that that's a replacement?
Yes,
kind of modern?
Yeah. I mean, they're a similar sort of colour. But apart from the colour, they're sort of very different beasts, really. I mean, Munstead Wood's beautiful. We've got lots in our garden here, and it's absolutely superb. But Tuscany Superb, the old roses, they just have a bit of extra character, maybe. And it's difficult to describe, really. But they're just different, So in your garden, you might have 2 geraniums that both have blue flowers, but they're different. And so you wouldn't reject another blue geranium because you've already got one blue geranium in your garden. So it's same with roses. There's lots and lots of pink roses, but just because you've got one pink rose, you're not going to reject all the rest of them. So they all have slightly different character and charm as well. Yeah, Munstead Wood repeat flowers, but Tuscany Superb has massive character.
I wonder if for some gardeners they have the impression that something that's a newer variety might be more disease resistant or kind of have slightly better characteristics. And I wondered how much do you think the historic roses have lost ground to the newer varieties because people have that impression?
It's incredibly variable. And so there's some historic roses that are bulletproof or virtually so, and then others which are really prone to disease. And exactly the same with the modern roses. Modern rose breeders are trying their best to develop varieties that are absolutely as healthy as possible. And they're doing a very good job. Yeah, again, it's just a matter of having a lovely variety. I mean, that's the problem. A lot of nurseries are limiting the number of varieties that they're selling. So people like David Austin's and Beals and things like that have limited their number of varieties they sell quite a lot. And completely understandable, because some of the varieties they sell, they might sell 1 or 2 a year, or sometimes even none. And so it's completely uncommercial to carry on selling those. So we all get a bit restricted to the number of varieties that we can buy. So it makes it tricky. So it's lovely to have that variety, but it's trying to persuade the nurseries. Otherwise, we'll all end up with each garden, we all have the sort of same range of varieties. I'm exaggerating, but it's saying variety is the spice of life. It's just wonderful to see different varieties. And just because something is not completely disease resistant then don't reject it. A lot of that depends on how you grow it. And I know people have been obsessed about spraying for many years, but now people have gone completely the other way, which is just absolutely brilliant. I mean, I've been growing roses for 40 years and never ever sprayed them once. And I never really felt the need to do it. But what I do, which is what a lot of other people do, they rather than having a rose garden with nothing but roses, which is a monoculture, and monocultures are just the worst thing, whether it's a human monoculture, an animal monoculture, or a plant monoculture, they're dreadful things. So our roses are mixed up with everything else in the garden. Of course, that makes it much more difficult for the pests and diseases to spread from one plant to the next. And something gets a bit disease, so what? Don't be obsessed by it. I think if there's one disease that everybody knows in the garden, not just on roses, but anything, is black spot. And so, people are hunting their roses for black spots, and they see a black spot, they're, oh gosh, panic, we've got to spray it or something. And same with aphids as well. I went to a garden the other day, and the owner spotted an insect on the flower. And what should we do about it? And actually, it was a beneficial insect, probably. It wasn't a harmful one. So, and actually, aphids in your garden are good. I say rather jokingly, you should actually be able to buy aphids from your local garden centre, because they attract in beneficial insects. If you've got nothing for the beneficial insects and the birds to feed off, then they're either going to die of starvation or buzz off somewhere else. So you need to attract everybody into the garden and let them fight it out themselves. You'll never beat nature. Nature is much more powerful, so it's much better to work with nature than trying to battle against it.
I agree, definitely. Thinking about the variety on offer in nurseries, I'm seeing more these days varieties that I suspect might be subject to plant breeders' rights, and I'm guessing the older roses aren't. So is that a consideration as well in terms of what becomes available?
Certainly, yes, all of the modern varieties will be subject to plant breeders' rights, which means that if they propagate a variety from another grower, then they need to pay a royalty of some sort. And that usually lasts sort of 20, 25 years. So the older roses are certainly not subject to that at all. So anybody can propagate those and sell them, no problem at all.
And also thinking about old versus newer, is it a generalisation to say that the older roses quite often have a better scent? Or is that true?
Again, hugely variable. Yes, a lot of the old roses have a wonderful fragrance, but not all of them. Some of them have no fragrance at all. And again, with the modern roses, I mean, Dave Austin varieties, the English roses, generally they have a wonderful fragrance. And it's something that people are looking at more and more. They always used to say that hybrid teas mostly had no fragrance. And it's certainly not 100% true, but they're not renowned for their fragrance, should we say. But on the plus side of the more modern roses, there's a huge variety of completely different fragrance types. And so the historic roses, certainly the true old roses, the Gallicas, Damask and things, they tend to be very much the old rose fragrance. Whereas in the rose world, there's a huge range of different fragrance types. And so there's 5 basic sorts. There's the old rose fragrance, a huge range of different fruity fragrances, the myrrh fragrance, the tea, and the musky fragrance. And so if you want to have a lovely variety of fragrances in your garden, then you're better off going to the more modern roses. Having said that, hybrid musks have a sort of a fruity fragrance, and the musky fragrances smell most commonly in the ramblers, things like Kiffsgate and Rambling Rector, things like that. So, yes, fragrance, very variable. Although fragrance is a very important character to me, and I like to have all my roses to be fragrant, there's certainly some in my garden, and I'm looking at one now called Adelaide d'Orléans, which is a rambler and just so beautiful, but it hardly has any fragrance at all, virtually nothing at all. But it's still very much worthwhile growing because it's such a beautiful rose. So don't dismiss roses because they haven't got a fragrance, but I think it is important. I mean, fragrance has this magical ability to calm you down at the same time raise your spirits. So always plant fragrant roses close to where you can access them for regular sniffing. We've got a variety called Buttercup, which is one of my favorite varieties, planted either side of one of our favorite seats. And so, we can sit there and pull a bloom down and give it a jolly good sniff. And it's just absolutely delightful.
Obviously, Buttercup's now on my shopping list. If people wanted to dip a toe into the water, are there any good varieties that you might recommend for people to start off with?
Of the historic roses,
Mm.
well, we mentioned Isfahan earlier on. That's actually arguably one of the very best ones. And also, you read books and catalogues, and it always tells you about Isfahan being a shrub rose, sort of like 4 or 5 feet tall by about the same across. But actually, a lot of these old roses can be grown as wonderful climbers, because some of them are a bit floppy old things, which can be a bit difficult to cope with. Actually growing them as a climber up an obelisk or something, or even an arch, can be absolutely superb. We mentioned Tuscany Superb as well, absolutely wonderful. Celsiana, another one of my favourites, semi-double flowers. Queen of Denmark, just the most fantastic fragrance, one of the Albas. Gosh, yeah, I mean, you can go on and on, really. And then of the climbers and ramblers, Adelaide d'Orléans is just absolutely superb. It's quite vigorous, so you need quite a lot of space. And then you've got rambling rector, of course, and things like that. So do be sure to give them plenty of space, otherwise they can become a menace.
Yeah, Isfahan can become a thicket, a sprawling thicket, if you're not careful, in my experience. So that's a really good tip about the obelisk.
If we go to the hybrid musks, which are sort of early 20th century, then there's Cornelia, Penelope. I've been seeing lots of Penelope this year in people's gardens, just looking absolutely wonderful, and Buff Beauty. So those are sort of 3 best known of the hybrid musks, just really lovely roses. The hybrid perpetuals and the bourbons, I tend not to include so much because their disease resistance is not so good and their growth is a little bit ungainly. But then there's another group of roses called the Portlands, which are absolutely wonderful, and they actually repeat flower and generally very good health and wonderful fragrance and very beautiful. So my favorite of those is one called Jacques Cartier, which is absolutely superb. And then the other one, which I absolutely love, some of the rugosa hybrids. So Rosa rugosa, bit of a coarse piece, but actually Rosa rugosa alba is very beautiful in the right place. It's wonderful, very fragrant, completely disease-free. And if you try and spray it, you'll scorch the leaves. And then these fantastic cherry tomato-like hips producing actually about now or a little bit later on. There's a hybrid of that called Hansa, which is a deep pink. And if you have deer problems or rabbits, that's one of the very few roses that they don't like. And the fragrance of that is just fantastic, absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, they are beautiful roses. Are there any places I'm thinking the UK, but maybe worldwide, where people can go and see a collection of them and maybe make assessments and pick out their favourites?
Well, the obvious one in this country is Mottisfont Abbey down in Hampshire, which has got the national collection of old roses, because it's a lot of them once flowering. The time to visit that is June time. And that's a very beautiful garden. And then there's the David Austin Rose Garden. They've got a good collection, Peter Beale's Rose Garden as well. And then Kew Gardens, I designed the garden down there at the back of the Palm House, and they've got quite a few old roses in that great mixture of different sorts of roses. Places like Hinton, Ampner, Helmingham Hall. More up north, then there's Wynyard Hall. They've got quite a good collection there as well. And up in Scotland, Carrollside, they've got a good collection as well. If you go to the Historic Roses Group website, there's lots of useful information and suggestions for really good varieties. So varieties that will give you huge amounts of pleasure, as well as being relatively easy to grow. And on there also you'll see a list of gardens, suggested gardens, where you can see good collections of historic roses. So it's a good website to go to. It's just called Historic Roses.
Well, you've answered my final question already, because that was it. Where can people go and find out more? But the website is a good resource, isn't it?
Yes. And of course, there's 1 or 2 books. I've just written a book called RHS Roses, in which I include quite a few old roses and quite a few rather unusual ones. And the wonderful thing about roses is not just that they're fantastically valuable for gardens, easily arguable that they're the most garden worthy of all plants, but of course they're absolutely central part of our character, and not just character in UK, but actually all around the world. So, all the Western countries all around Europe and North America and down to South America, South Africa and Australasia, but also across Middle East, India, China, Japan. I mean, you could argue actually they're certainly in part of Middle Eastern countries and the Far East, that they're more crucial or have been in the past to their cultures than we have been. And so if you want to read more about that, which I think is a fascinating subject, is a book called Roses by Jennifer Potter. And that is such an interesting book.
Thank you very much to Michael for taking the time to talk about historic roses, and thanks to you for listening. If you grow a historic rose variety, please do email me your recommendations or tag the podcast on social media with a photo, as I'm a sucker for a rose. Get it? I'll see myself out. I'll leave you now in the capable hands of Dr. Ian Bedford with his bug of the week.
For many of us, growing flowering plants in and around our homes and watching their blooms come and go gives us great pleasure and satisfaction. But as we relish the splendour of flowers, it's easy to forget that they're produced by plants for a specific purpose, which certainly isn't just to please us. They're there to generate visual and olfactory signals to attract sugar-feeding insects to them, informing the insects that inside the flower there should be a little drop of sweet nectar for them to find. A generous gift from the flower, but the fact the nectar is at the base of the flower's reproductive structures reveals the purpose of this sugary treat. Since as the insects struggle to reach the nectar, they become dusted with pollen from the male parts of the flower, the anthers, which then gets carried on their bodies to the female parts, the stigmas of other flowers, cross-pollinating and enabling the plants to reproduce. And this is the process we witness in our gardens when sugar-feeding insects visit the flowers, from butterflies to flower beetles and from hoverflies to wasps, where they'll all inadvertently acquire and disperse pollen grains whilst they search for the little drops of nectar. With the most widely recognised group of pollinating insects, though, the bees, it's a little bit different, because although they'll inadvertently transfer pollen between flowers, they'll almost all be specifically collecting it as food for their larvae. And they'll have morphological features that enable them to carry large bundles of it back to their nests, whether it's in a hollow basket shape on their legs, called a corbicula, or amongst tufts of hairs, called scopa. Watching the bees in our gardens, we'll see that most species are polylectic, which means they collect pollen and nectar from many different plants. But there'll be just a few that are oligolectic bees, species that associate with just a small number of closely related plants. And this is the case for our smallest bee, the solitary Harebell carpenter, which appears only for a few weeks during the summer, when the campanulas are in bloom. And it's the males of this tiny, narrow-bodied black bee, only 6 millimetres long, that are first seen emerging from a nest to fly off and enter a freshly opened campanula flower. Settling at the bottom of the bell-shaped corolla, the male drinks nectar, whilst he waits for a female to appear, sometimes over many days. Then when one eventually enters the flower, they'll mate, before the male flies off to die. The female then gets to work, collecting the flower's pollen grains, which she attaches to hairs on the underside of her body. Fully loaded, she leaves the flower to find a little hole in dead wood or the hollow end of straw on a thatched roof, where she'll crawl inside to lay her eggs, leaving each with enough pollen for the resulting larva to feed on, and develop into the next generation of Harebell carpenter bees that'll emerge 10 months later when the campanulas are in flower again.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.